The syringe slipped from my trembling fingers and clattered across the hospital floor as I stared into those hollow, endless eyes. Death had returned, and this time, he wasn't here to save me. The cardiac monitor flatlined behind him, its shrill scream echoing through the empty ICU as he spoke my name with that same disapproving sigh I remembered from 15 years ago. "Hello again, Marcus." I should explain how I got here. How I ended up face to face with that tall figure in his impossibly black robes for the second time in my life. But first, you need to understand what happened the first time we met. 15 years ago, I was nothing. Worse than nothing. I was a broken pre-med student drowning in a cocktail of depression, alcohol, and self-hatred. I'd lost everything that mattered. My girlfriend Sarah, my scholarship, my family's respect. That night, sitting in my dorm room with an empty bottle of whiskey and a handful of stolen morphine from the hospital where I'd been volunteering, I made the decision to end it all. The morphine was already coursing through my veins when he appeared, with that towering shadow with a void where his face should be. But instead of taking me, he spoke in that deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You don't get to decide this, Marcus," he said, and somehow I knew exactly who or what he was. I remember laughing, actually laughing at death himself. "Why do you care? I'm nobody. I'm nothing." "What if I told you," he said, settling into the chair across from me like we were old friends, "that in 5 years, you'd graduate medical school at the top of your class? What if I told you that Sarah would see the man you'd become and fall in love with you all over again?" The morphine made everything feel distant, dreamlike, but his words cut through the fog like a scalpel. "What if I told you you'd save hundreds of lives as an emergency room doctor? That you'd marry Sarah in the hospital chapel where you first met? That you'd have twin daughters who would look at you like you hung the stars themselves?" I felt tears mixing with the chemical numbness. That's impossible. Is it?" Death leaned forward, and I swear I could feel him smiling beneath that infinite darkness. "Or are you just afraid to find out?" I chose to live that night, and everything death promised, every single thing, came true. I graduated valedictorian from Johns Hopkins. Sarah and I reconnected during my residency, and she saw something in me I'd forgotten existed. We married 3 years later, and our twin girls, Emma and Sophie, became the center of our universe. I became one of the most respected ER doctors in the city, pulling people back from the brink every single day. For 12 years, life was everything death had promised, and more. But you know how these stories go, don't you? You know there's always a price. It started 6 months ago with a patient, a man brought in after a motorcycle accident. Massive internal bleeding, multiple fractures, barely clinging to life. Standard trauma case, nothing I hadn't handled 1,000 times before. But as I worked on him, as I fought to save his life, I realized who he was. Derek Hoffman, the drunk driver who'd killed a family of 4 3 years earlier. The man who'd walked away with a slap on the wrist while 2 parents and their children were buried in the ground. My hands froze over his chest, the defibrillator paddles growing heavy in my grip. He was dying, and I was the only thing standing between him and the grave he'd escaped once before. The monitors were screaming, the nurses were shouting instructions, but all I could think about was that family, about justice that had never come. I let him die. I stood there and watched Derek Hoffman's heart stop beating, and I did nothing. The official report said we did everything possible, that his injuries were too severe. No one questioned it, no one suspected, but I knew, and somehow, I think death knew too. The next case was easier. A gang member who'd shot a teenager outside a school, brought in with a bullet wound to the chest. As his blood pressure dropped and his pulse grew weak, I made a choice. I accidentally disconnected his IV. I forgot to administer the blood thinner. Simple mistakes, tragic oversights. He died on my table, and I felt satisfaction. Then came the child molester who'd been released on a technicality, the corporate executive who'd poisoned a water supply, the hit-and-run driver who'd left a pregnant woman bleeding in the street. One by one, they found their way to my ER, and one by one, I became their final judgment. I was saving the world from monsters, or so I told myself. But tonight was different. Tonight, they brought in someone I recognized, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. Tommy Chen, 19 years old, overdose victim, barely breathing. The same Tommy Chen who'd been behind the wheel during a street race that killed my neighbor's 8-year-old son. The same Tommy Chen who'd walked away with community service while that little boy's parents buried their child. As I prepared the naloxone that would save his life, my hands began to shake. This wasn't some random criminal. This was personal. This was justice begging to be served. I reached for the wrong syringe instead. The one filled with potassium chloride. One injection, and Tommy Chen's heart would stop beating forever. No one would question it. Overdose victims died all the time. The syringe was in my hand, the needle finding his IV port, when the lights in the trauma room suddenly dimmed. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant, and I felt that familiar presence behind me. "Hello again, Marcus." I spun around, and there he was. Death himself, standing in the corner of my trauma room like he'd been waiting for me all along. "You," I whispered, the syringe trembling in my grip. "Why are you here?" "You know why." His voice carried that same disapproving tone from 15 years ago, but now there was something else, disappointment. "You've been busy, haven't you?" The monitors around Tommy Chen continued their steady rhythm, but I could feel time slowing, stretching like taffy as Death and I faced each other across the small room. "They deserve to die," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Every single one of them. They were monsters. And what does that make you, Marcus?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I looked down at the syringe in my hand, at the unconscious boy on the table, at the career I'd built on saving lives. And I saw what I'd become. "I was helping people," I whispered. "I was making the world better, by becoming the very thing you swore to fight against." Death moved closer, and I could feel that infinite coldness radiating from him. "You took an oath, Marcus. First, do no harm. Remember?" I did remember. The Hippocratic Oath, spoken with trembling voice in a lecture hall full of hopeful medical students. Sarah had been in the audience that day, tears in her eyes as she watched me promise to heal, never to hurt. "But they were evil," I said, my voice cracking. "They hurt innocent people, and you think that gave you the right to play God?" Death's laugh was like wind through a graveyard. "You think I didn't notice when Derek Hoffman's heart monitor showed signs of life for 30 seconds after you walked away? When Maria Santos could have survived if you hadn't forgotten her blood transfusion?" My knees nearly buckled. He knew. He'd known all along. Every soul has a time, Marcus. A moment when they're meant to leave this world. You've been stealing those moments, taking lives that weren't yours to take. The syringe felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in my hand. Tommy Chen's breathing was shallow but steady, his young face peaceful despite the poison coursing through his system. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Are you here to stop me? To punish me?" Death was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost sad. "I'm here to offer you the same choice I offered 15 years ago, Marcus. The choice between life and death, between redemption and damnation." "I don't understand." "Tommy Chen dies tonight," Death said simply. His overdose is too severe. His organs are already shutting down. But you can choose how his story ends. You can inject that potassium chloride and become a murderer, or you can try to save him and remain a doctor. I looked down at the boy on the table. I really looked at him. Beneath the pallor and the drug-induced unconsciousness, he looked so young, so much like I had at 19. Lost, broken, making terrible choices that would define the rest of his life. But he killed that little boy, I whispered. Yes, Death nodded. And if you save him tonight, he'll spend the next 40 years living with that guilt. He'll dedicate his life to children's safety advocacy. He'll prevent 100 accidents, save 1,000 lives. His guilt will drive him to become something better than he ever thought possible. My hand loosened around the syringe. How do you know? The same way I knew you'd become a great doctor instead of a corpse in a dorm room 15 years ago. Death stepped closer, and I could see myself reflected in that endless void where his face should be. The same way I know that if you make the wrong choice tonight, your daughters will grow up wondering why their father threw away everything good in his life for revenge. Emma and Sophie, God, what would they think if they knew what I'd become? But what about justice? I asked, tears streaming down my cheeks now. What about all the people these criminals hurt? Justice isn't yours to give, Marcus. Your job, your purpose, is to heal. To give people a chance at redemption, even when they don't deserve it, especially when they don't deserve it. The monitors around Tommy Chen began to alarm, his heart rate dropping, his breathing becoming more labored. Time was running out. I looked at the syringe in my hand, one choice that would make me a killer forever. Then, I looked at the naloxone on the crash cart, the choice that would make me a doctor again. If I save him, I said slowly, what happens to me? Do I go to prison for the others? Death tilted his head, and I swear I could feel him smiling. What others, Marcus? All I see is a dedicated emergency room physician who's never lost a patient he could save. Understanding washed over me like a wave. The files, the investigations, the guilt. It would all disappear. The families of my victims would never know their loved ones had been murdered. They'd grieve natural deaths, unexpected complications, tragic but explainable losses. But I would remember. I would carry the weight of what I'd done for the rest of my life. Is that my punishment? I asked. It's your choice, Death replied. Redemption always comes with a price. Tommy Chen's heart rate flatlined for 3 seconds. 4, 5. I dropped the potassium chloride and lunged for the naloxone, injecting it directly into his IV as I started chest compressions. Come on, I whispered, pumping his chest with desperate rhythm. Come on, you stupid kid. Don't you die on me. The monitors shrieked around us, but I kept working. Kept fighting for a life I'd been ready to take just moments before. Death watched silently from the corner as I poured everything I had into saving Tommy Chen. After what felt like hours, the boy's heart rate steadied. His breathing deepened. His eyes fluttered open, confused and frightened but alive. When I finally looked up, Death was gone. But his words echoed in my mind like a promise and a warning. Tommy recovered fully. 3 weeks later, I saw him on the news, speaking at a high school about the dangers of street racing, tears streaming down his face as he talked about the little boy he'd killed. He started a foundation in that child's name. Last month, they passed a law requiring stricter penalties for illegal racing, a law that will save countless lives. I still work in the ER. I still save lives every day. But sometimes, when I'm working on someone I know has hurt others, someone who doesn't deserve the second chance I'm fighting to give them, I remember what Death told me about justice and redemption, and I choose to heal instead of hurt. Because that's what doctors do. We fight for every life, even the ones that don't deserve fighting for. especially those ones. But if you're out there listening to this, if you're facing your own moment of choice between light and darkness, remember this: death is always watching. And sometimes, the difference between salvation and damnation is as simple as choosing to help instead of harm. The choice is always yours, but so are the consequences. So, what will you choose? If this story made you think about the choices in your own life, if it reminded you that redemption is always possible, then maybe it's worth sharing with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes a story can save a life just as surely as a doctor can. What would you do if death gave you a second chance? Let me know in the comments, and maybe share this with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to choose differently.